Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at one of the most debated passages in the whole Bible, Matthew 24.
Hmm.
We got a ton of questions from you guys about it, and a fascinating collection of commentary excerpts from all sorts of theologians,
Yeah.
and they're all wrestling with this question. What
Mm.
did Jesus actually mean when he talked about, the end of the age?
It's almost like we have a time machine, you know? We get to kind of peek into the minds of these brilliant thinkers across history as they're trying to decipher this prophetic puzzle.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've got some big names here. We've got Blomberg, Wilkin, France, Noland, Morris, Osborne, Lenski, Walvoord, and Hagner.
Wow, yeah, that's quite the lineup.
All heavy hitters when it comes to biblical scholarship.
For sure.
And they're all grappling with this concept of preterism.
The Preterism, yeah, it's this idea that some or even all of the prophecies in the Bible have already happened.
Yeah.
And when you apply that to Matthew 24,
Right.
with all this talk about the destruction of the temple and cosmic signs and the second coming of Christ,
Yeah.
things get really, really interesting.
Well, and that's the thing is we know that the temple was destroyed
Right.
in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And it happened, just a few decades after Jesus gave this whole prophecy.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, did he nail it? Or is there even more to the story?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And our commentators, they offer a whole spectrum of answers.
Okay.
Some, like Blomberg, he suggests that these early events that Jesus mentions,
Right.
like wars and rumors of wars, were fulfilled by the temple's destruction in 70 AD.
Okay.
But that event, in his view, was just the opening act. It's
Wow.
setting the stage for Christ's second coming.
So it's like a two-part prophecy.
Exactly, yeah.
And part one is already checked off.
Precisely. But even Blomberg acknowledges that untangling the threads of this prophecy
Right.
is a real challenge.
Yeah.
And then you have someone like Wilkin,
Okay.
who comes from a dispensationalist perspective.
Now, for those of us who need a refresher, dispensationalism views God's plan as unfolding in these distinct stages,
Right.
each with its own sort of set of rules and a specific focus.
Imagine it like a play
Right.
with different acts.
Okay.
And for dispensationalists, Matthew 24 is all about a future tribulation period
Okay.
and a rebuilt temple.
Okay. Interesting.
Oh.
But that raises a whole other set of questions, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what does it mean for us today
Right.
if the whole prophecy is about some far off future event?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where someone like France comes in.
Okay.
He's a strong advocate for a preterist interpretation.
Okay.
He connects the first part of Matthew 24 directly to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Right.
But then he takes it a step further and
later.
argues that the way Jesus talks about his coming
Mm-hmm.
might have had a different meaning in a first century Jewish context.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. What do you mean by that? How could coming mean something different than what we typically assume?
Well, Franz points out that in the Old Testament, the language of coming was often used to describe God's intervention in history,
Okay.
particularly when establishing his authority.
Okay.
So when Jesus talks about his coming,
Yeah.
he might not have been referring to a literal, like, physical return,
Right.
but rather to his assumption of authority,
Yeah.
especially as it relates to judgment upon Jerusalem.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That really makes you rethink how you read the passage, doesn't it?
It really does.
So if France is right,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe these dramatic events that Jesus describes,
Right.
like the sun being darkened and the stars falling,
Yeah.
aren't literal descriptions of the end of the world,
Yeah.
but more symbolic language
Exactly.
about the upheaval and judgment surrounding the temple's destruction.
That's exactly what he argues.
Okay.
And Noland, another commentator, has a similar view.
Mm-hmm.
He links the coming of the Son of Man to the destruction of the temple,
Okay.
but doesn't necessarily see it as a full-blown end of the world event.
So in their view, the coming is more about Jesus's power and judgment being made manifest in a historical event.
Right, and that event in this case would be the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Right.
But then you have someone like Morris who's kind of straddling the fence.
Okay.
He suggests that Jesus could be referring to 70 AD, the end times, or both all at the same time.
Talk about keeping your options open. It's almost like he's saying Jesus was speaking on multiple levels, weaving together different timelines and meanings.
It's a more fluid approach.
Right.
It recognizes that prophetic language can be complex and multi-layered.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that even among these brilliant scholars, there's no easy consensus on how to interpret this passage.
Yeah, and that's just the first few commentators.
I know, right?
We've still got Osborne, Lenski, Walvoord, and Hagner to unpack.
Indeed, and each one brings their own unique insights and perspectives to the table, adding even more layers to this fascinating discussion.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. Let's dive into the rest of these commentaries and see what other treasures we can uncover.
Let's do it.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've got more commentaries to look at, right?
We do.
So what's next?
Well, next up we have Osborne, and he actually lays out 4 different interpretations of Matthew 24, which I think is a pretty good indication of just how complex this passage is.
Okay.
He carefully weighs the arguments for each view, ultimately kind of leaning towards a perspective that sees the destruction of Jerusalem as foreshadowing future events.
So in a way, he's saying that what happened in 70 AD was like a mini apocalypse, a preview of what's to come on a grander scale.
That's one way to understand it. It's a kind of type and anti-type approach where historical events serve as symbolic representations of their ultimate fulfillment in the future.
Interesting. So even though Osborne acknowledges like the historical significance of 70 AD, he still sees it as pointing forward to a future climax.
Exactly. And then we have Lenski, who draws a much clearer line in the sand.
Okay.
He sees a distinct division between the events surrounding the destruction of the temple and the second coming.
So for him, there's no blurring of timelines, no blending of past and future.
Right. He sees a clear shift in focus around verse 27.
Okay.
Where the language becomes explicitly about the parousia, which is the Greek term for the second coming.
Okay, so Lenski's view is more in line with a traditional understanding of Matthew 24 as a straightforward prophecy about the end of the world.
Precisely. And then we have Walvoord.
Okay.
And he takes a very different approach. Okay. He's coming from a strong dispensationalist framework, and in a move that I think might surprise some listeners. He denies that the discourse refers to either the temple's destruction or the church.
Wait, hold on. He's saying that Matthew 24 is about neither the destruction of the temple nor the church.
Right.
That seems like a pretty radical interpretation.
It is, and it highlights just how much one's theological framework can influence how they read and understand Scripture.
Right.
Walvoord has a very specific timeline in mind, one that doesn't fit neatly with a preterist interpretation or even with a more traditional futurist view.
So for him, Matthew 24 is about a very specific period in God's plan.
That's right.
That's yet to unfold.
That's right. And it's important to remember that within the world of biblical scholarship, there are many different schools of thought.
Right.
Each with its own set of presuppositions and interpretive methods.
It's like we're exploring this vast and complex landscape.
Right.
And each commentator is offering us a different map. They're highlighting different landmarks and pathways.
A very apt analogy.
Yeah.
And finally, we have Hagner.
Okay.
And he kind of dives deep into the preterist, futurist, and mixed interpretations.
Okay.
He carefully weighs the strengths and weaknesses of each view.
So he's not afraid to get his hands dirty, so to speak.
Not at all.
Wading into the complexities of the debate.
And he brings up a key point that we haven't really touched on yet.
Okay.
The tension between the idea of the second coming's imminence and the fact that we don't know the exact timing.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, on the one hand, Jesus seems to suggest that his return could happen, at any moment.
Right.
But on the other hand, he also says that no one knows the day or the hour.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile those two ideas?
That's the challenge. And Hagner, he acknowledges this tension, ultimately kind of leaning towards a preterist view, but suggesting that the prophecy also foreshadows future events.
Okay. So he's sort of bridging the gap,
right?
Between those who see Matthew 24 as entirely fulfilled in the past, and those who see it as pointing to a future climax.
Right. He sees the destruction of the temple in 70 AD as the primary fulfillment of the prophecy.
Right.
But also acknowledges that there might be a sense in which those events foreshadow a future, a more cosmic fulfillment as well.
It's fascinating to see how these different commentators are wrestling with the same text.
It is.
Yet coming to such different conclusions.
Yeah.
I mean, it really underscores the complexity of biblical interpretation, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just an academic exercise.
Right.
These interpretations have real world implications for how we understand God's plan, our place in history, and what it means to live as followers of Christ in a world that often feels like it's teetering on the brink.
Absolutely. So having taken this whirlwind tour through 9 different commentaries, what are some of the key takeaways? What stands out to you as the most significant insights or points of agreement and disagreement?
Well, one thing that most commentators seem to agree on is that at least some of Matthew 24 refers to events surrounding the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's a pretty significant starting point, wouldn't you say?
For sure. It grounds the prophecy in a concrete historical event, something that's often overlooked in popular interpretations of Matthew 24.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we can't just read this passage through a purely futuristic lens, detached from its historical context.
Right. But even if we agree that 70 AD is a key part of the puzzle, the debate still rages on about whether all of Matthew 24 was fulfilled in that event, or whether some of it, particularly those verses with the dramatic cosmic imagery, points to a future final climax.
That's the heart of the matter, and as we've seen, there's no easy answer. Some commentators like France and Nolan, they see a strong connection between the coming of the Son of Man and the destruction of the temple, suggesting that Jesus's coming was manifest in that historical event.
But then others like Blomberg, they see a split timeline with the destruction of the temple serving as a prelude to a still future second coming.
Exactly. And then you have those like Walvoord who see the entire prophecy as pointing to a specific period in God's plan that's yet to unfold.
It's enough to make your head spin.
It is.
But honestly, I find it all incredibly fascinating.
Me too.
We've got these brilliant minds grappling with the same text. Yet coming to such diverse conclusions. It really highlights the richness and complexity of Scripture.
It certainly does, and I think it's a healthy reminder that even the most learned scholars don't have all the answers. Biblical interpretation is an ongoing conversation, a journey of discovery that requires humility, careful study, and a willingness to engage with different perspectives.
Well said. But beyond those big picture questions, about the timeline and the fulfillment of Matthew 24, were there any smaller details or specific arguments that really caught your attention? Any aha moments?
Oh, absolutely.
That made you see the passage in a new light?
One that really stood out to me was France's argument about how Jesus's use of the word coming might have been understood differently
Right.
in a first century Jewish context.
Right.
It challenges our assumptions about what prophetic language is supposed to sound like, and forces us to consider how our own cultural and historical baggage might be shaping our interpretation.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in our own preconceived notions about what certain words or phrases must mean.
Yeah.
But sometimes we need to step back and try to understand the text on its own terms, within its original historical and cultural context.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning different interpretations of Matthew 24.
Right.
It's about developing a more nuanced and informed approach to biblical interpretation in general.
Right. It's like we're being trained to become better readers, more attuned to the subtle nuances of language, of context, and of historical background.
Exactly. And that kind of training is essential.
Yeah.
Not just for understanding Matthew 24, but for engaging with any passage of Scripture.
And speaking of engaging with Scripture, I've got to say, this deep dive has really, really sparked my curiosity.
That's great.
I'm starting to see Matthew 24 in a whole new light, with all its layers of meaning and historical significance.
That's fantastic to hear. And I think that's the goal of any good deep dive, to inspire further exploration, to open up new avenues of thought and understanding.
Well, mission accomplished. I'm definitely feeling inspired to dig deeper into these commentaries and see what other treasures I can unearth.
Excellent. And I have a feeling that as you continue to explore, you'll discover even more fascinating insights and connections.
I have no doubt about it. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's wrap up this part of our deep dive by reflecting on some of the bigger questions that these commentaries have raised. Questions that go beyond the specifics of Matthew 24 and touch on our understanding of history, of prophecy, and the role of the church today.
That's a great idea. After all, the goal of biblical interpretation isn't just to accumulate knowledge, but to allow that knowledge to shape our lives, our faith, and our understanding of the world around us.
Exactly. So let's shift gears for a moment and ponder some of those bigger questions. I think our listeners will find it thought-provoking, to say the least.
I agree.
We've spent all this time unpacking these commentaries on Matthew 24, and I feel like there's a bigger question here. It's like we've been assembling this giant jigsaw puzzle, right? Piecing together all these different interpretations of this prophecy, but now we kind of need to step back and look at the whole picture.
I agree. And I think one of the most profound questions that emerges from this whole deep dive is this: what does it mean for us today if some or even all of Matthew 24 has already been fulfilled?
That's a huge question, isn't it?
It is.
It's like the ground shifts beneath our feet.
Right.
When we start to consider that those cataclysmic events, the destruction of the temple, the signs in the heavens, might not be future events, but echoes of the past.
It certainly challenges some traditional assumptions about the end times. And it raises a whole host of new questions.
Right.
I mean, if those events were fulfilled in the first century, how does that shape our understanding of history, of prophecy, and the role of the church today?
Right. It's like we've been looking through the wrong end of the telescope this whole time. Focusing on this distant future, when maybe the most significant events have already happened.
It's a real perspective shift for sure. And it might lead some to wonder if we should be looking for a more symbolic or spiritual fulfillment of the remaining prophecies rather than a literal one.
That's a fascinating thought. So instead of expecting like fire raining down from the sky, or a physical second coming on the clouds, maybe we should be looking for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how God's purposes are being worked out in history.
Perhaps. Or maybe it means that the end times aren't some far off event, but something that's been unfolding throughout history in a waves of judgment and renewal.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
It's less about a sudden dramatic climax
Right.
and more about an ongoing process,
Yeah.
a story that's still being written.
Exactly. And if that's the case,
Yeah.
it makes the call to be ready to be faithful even more urgent, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, because it's not about escaping this world
Right.
or waiting for some future rescue. It's about living faithfully in the here and now, participating in God's ongoing work of redemption,
Yeah.
even amidst all the chaos and uncertainty.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the real heart of Matthew 24, I think. It's not just a prophecy about the future.
Right.
It's a call to discipleship.
Right.
A reminder that we're to be people of hope and perseverance,
Yeah.
even in the face of tribulation.
It's a reminder that following Jesus isn't about predicting the future,
Right.
but about living faithfully in the present,
Yeah.
trusting in his promises
Mm-hmm.
and seeking to embody his love and grace in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've just about reached the bottom of this particular deep dive.
I think so.
And wow, what a journey it's been.
It has been.
We've explored so many interpretations. We've grappled with some weighty theological concepts, and we've encountered some truly mind-bending ideas.
It's been a privilege to explore these commentaries with you.
Yeah.
And to witness your own journey of discovery.
Absolutely, yeah. And to our listeners, we've just provided you with the highlights.
Right.
But the real treasures are buried in the source material itself.
Yeah.
So I encourage you, grab those commentaries, put on your thinking caps,
Right.
and embark on your own deep dive into Matthew 24. You might be surprised at what you uncover.
Happy diving.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.